All right. Hi, everybody. Hello, and welcome to today's webinar with Ocean Networks Canada. My name is Luisa Sarmiento, and I will be moderating this session today. We also have Kaylin Correa, who will help us with the interactivity and to monitor the chat today. And finally, we have our speaker, Christian Kane, who's right there. So first, let me introduce Ocean Networks Canada Fall Webinar Series. So the aim of this series was to offer free online interactive events featuring ocean-related topics. Today is our last webinar of the fall. This series introduced both scientific and indigenous approaches to understand ocean changes and their importance nowadays. Today's webinar will be about the impacts of underwater noise on marine life with our wonderful speaker, Christian Kanes. So now let's see how you can participate in today's session.
All right, so as you can see on the screen, you can participate in Mentimeter. So simply go to menti.com and enter the following code, 8050345. You can do this on your smartphone, use a different browser tab, or download the application Mentimeter. And if that's not possible for you, just put your answers and comments in our Zoom chat.
Great. So now let's see the first question. All right. I see that most of you have answered a lot of things. Great. So we have people from Halifax, from Victoria, obviously, from the Netherlands, also some people from Europe, Bath, England, wow, a lot of people, Newfoundland, from Germany, it's very active, from Bedford, from Ucluelet, from Bremen, Port Said, Coast Salish, Barbados. Wow, great diversity. Great. From Bassam Bay, from Leiden, from Tofino, from Chester, from the US, from Mississauga, from Nova Scotia. That's great. Wow, I see a lot of people from all around the place. It's so great to have you for this last webinar. So some people also input some comments in the chat. So make sure that you're active in the chat throughout the webinar today too. All right, great. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Christian Kanes. So Christian joined the Science Services team in October of 2018. Prior to that, and throughout their Bachelor's of Science degree in biology at the University of Victoria, Christian worked as a research assistant with several BC-based cetacean research organizations and in various capacities at ONC, focusing on acoustic data, which you will get to know today. These experiences led them to develop an appreciation for passive acoustic research methods as a way to both study at-risk species non-intrusively and study offshore species that are otherwise difficult to observe. Prior to joining the Sciences Services team, Christian completed a Master's of Science degree at the University of Victoria, focusing on patterns in Pacific white-sided dolphins communication at Barkley Canyon. So in their free time, Christian is a jack of all trades, master of none, with more hobbies than they know what to do with. So from gaming to climbing and circus to books, Christian can usually be found engaging in their hobbies of the moment, and you can be sure that they'll be into something else next month. So with that, I give the floor to you, Christian.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So before we get started, I'd like to thank our host nations and acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territories the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And I'll tell you a little bit about me before we get started as well. As was mentioned, my background is in marine biology and acoustics with a specialty in marine mammals. And more often than not, I'm behind the camera than in front of it. And like many of you now, I'm working at home during COVID. So my photography skills that were once applied to wildlife are typically applied to my two beautiful cats. They're lovely subjects, but I can't help but feel I've lost a bit of the dignity of my subject matter by switching to them. And I'll tell you a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the importance of sound and the different ways animals use sound in the ocean. And then we'll talk about the effects of anthropogenic ocean noise, which is human-made noise, and highlight some impacts specifically of vessel noise, and then talk about what we can do. So moving on to the importance of sound, we're going to start with a Menti participation moment.
You can go to menti.com and enter the code 8050345. So now we're going to play the game Guess the Sound. So you're going to hear something, and please just try to guess whatever you think this is. And go ahead, Kristen, play the sound. Okay, that's a very, very beautiful, interesting spectrogram. So I think we already have some guesses over here. Some people put in the chat orca, whale, tiger. We also have in the Menti humpback whales, underwater cowpig, beluga, dolphin, Wookiee, baleen whale, sea lion, seal, sea elephant, elephant seal, yes, whale shark, fin whale. Okay, we have many, many different types of guesses. What do you think could be the right one, or which one is the right one, Kristen?
I really wish I could say the right one was Wookiee. It's why I really like playing this one for people, because someone usually guesses Wookiee, but the answer is a humpback whale.
Great, great. So these are really great guesses. Thank you, everybody. We'll continue and explore more on the sounds. So back to you, Christian.
All right, so to get on the same page, we're going to start with just some basics of what sound is. It's a longitudinal pressure wave, so this means that the wave moves in the direction that the pressure is applied rather than oscillating. And it's caused by a pressure disturbance in a medium. And what we can see in the GIF shown, which is an important thing to consider, is the particle motion. And you'll notice that the particles don't actually travel with the pressure. They just are displaced back and forth as they contract and expand because of the pressure movement. And sound is very important to a lot of animals. Some species have evolved to lack sight, like naked mole rats and cavefish, but no vertebrate species that I know of lack hearing. And there's more ways to hear than just ears. Elephants can sense low-frequency rumble vocalizations with their sensitive feet. Spiders can hear with their leg hairs. Fish have inner ear bones called otoliths that can hear sound, as well as pressure-sensitive lateral lines. And marine invertebrates have statocysts, which is what this diagram on the bottom right is here. It's a balance organ that has a little ball inside of a sac with little hairs, and the little hairs can sense pressure. And some of them have external hairs as well. And all marine mammals make sounds. So why is sound so important in the ocean? Well, light doesn't travel very far in the ocean. In the tropical regions, it only travels about 200 meters. And in areas like where I live, where there's high productivity in British Columbia, light can only travel about 50 meters. So it's not a very efficient thing for sensing. But sound can travel tens to thousands of kilometers. And what we see on the right is a diagram from the US Geological Survey of where the Alaskan earthquake in 2018 was recorded as having happened. And we actually recorded the sound of that earthquake all the way down at Vancouver Island, 1,700 kilometers away. So sound can travel really great distances in the ocean. And so many marine animals have made it their primary sense. So now we're going to have another Menti participation moment.
Great. All right. So now we're asking you all, what instrument do we use to measure sound underwater? So for that, we have 4 different guesses: hydrospheres, hydroplanes, hydrophones, or hydroprobes. please go to menti.com and enter the code 805034.5. So I see we have already 45 people that answered, so that's great. Most of them, okay, none answered hydroplanes, and most of them answered hydrophones. So I'll give it to you, Christian, to comment on that.
All right, it looks like we've got a lot of people who are familiar with ocean sound here, because hydrophone is in fact the correct answer.
Great. All right, so let's hear more about that. Back to you.
So at Ocean Networks Canada, we're listening to all of these sounds using, you guessed it, hydrophones. We have 23 hydrophones across 14 different sites, with more sites planned. And the sites include those pictured, and I'll zoom in so we can see them. All of these little orange boxes are places that we have hydrophones, and we have hydrophones farther up the coast as well, and one in the Arctic. And we've recorded a lot of different animals at Ocean Networks Canada. We've recorded California sea lions, 5 different species of baleen whales, including blues, fins, minkies, humpbacks, and gray whales, 5 delphinid species, including the ever popular orcas, and we've recorded all 4 of the different local orca communities. We've recorded 1 other toothed whale species, the sperm whales, and at least 1 species of fish that I know of. And I say at least 1 species with a big caveat, because there's a lot of research happening right now to catalog the different sounds that fish species make. And we've surely recorded more species than just sablefish, but we don't have them, we haven't identified them conclusively yet, but we're working on it. And we also have a few unconfirmed cetacean species as well that we're not sure which animal made the sound. So on to some uses of the sound in the ocean. We'll have you guess first.
All right. So first, I just want to say sorry about the gray boxes problem. I don't think it will be most of the presentation. It's a Zoom internal issue, so like all of our new virtual things, we have to deal with that. But first, let's go to another Menti moment. So we're going to go and try to answer the question, how are sounds used by marine organisms? And once again, you can go to menti.com and enter the code 805034.5. All right, so we already have some great answers. To communicate, mostly, directions, hunting, socializing, navigating, maybe avoiding predators, to reproduce, talking, detect food, prey. Yeah, maybe Christian, you can comment on what about interspecies communication? Could that be one?
Yeah, so intraspecies communication is communication within animals that are of the same species. That's definitely a way that sound is used, and probably for interspecies communication as well, because we don't always have to know exactly what something means to know whether it's a warning of some kind. So all kinds of communication sound can be used for.
Great. All right. So we also have some guesses about mating, courtships. So I guess that also applies, right?
It sure does.
Great. All right. So we'll go back to you then to learn more about this.
All right, so we're going to talk about a lot of these answers that have been given. It looks like we have a lot of people who know a lot about marine animal sounds, but we'll talk about it in depth anyways. So one of the ways, I wasn't expecting. One of the ways that sound is used is attracting mates. And this video that I'm going to show you, we're going to play some sounds for you with it. This is the lovely song of a midshipman fish. These fish, the males, build nests and then sing to attract a female to come mate with them. So if you're thinking to yourself, wait, that's a song, that's not just a foghorn, well, now you know why they're called the midshipman fish. It's also used for defending territory. This is a picture of a toadfish, and these fish make aggressive sounds to keep other animals away from their home. Can be used for staying in touch if animals are out of sight from one another. It can be used for socializing, and this video is a video of 2 different families of northern resident killer whales from the A clan and the G clan hanging out together and talking. And it can also even be used for signaling social relationships. This photo is of two southern resident killer whales. And the southern resident killer whales, like the northerns, have their own accents for different families, and they even have their own favorite calls that they make the most often. And I'll play an example of each of them for you now. This is the J-Pod S1 call. This is the K-Pod S16. It sounds like kittens mewing. And L-Pod's S19 call. Sound can also be used for finding the right home. Recent research on coral species has found that the pelagic life stage, the stage at which they're just larvae floating around in the ocean, actually figure out where to settle and grow into corals by listening for the sounds of coral reefs. Sound can be used for navigating vast habitats, both by using passive listening, as the large baleen whales do, and by using active sounds like echolocation. And it can be used for finding food. Delphinids use echolocation to navigate and find food, and the way that they do this is they move air back and forth in their nasal sacs, which is focused, it makes a clicking sound that's focused by the fat in their melon, and that travels out in a concentrated beam and then is received by their jaw bones, which rattles their ear bones, and they can hear the received sound. And it can also even be used for catching food. The two photos we have here are a young southern resident killer whale with a salmon, and there have been some reports that southern resident killer whales, some of them anyways, have been using highly concentrated bursts of clicks to stun prey. And the picture on the right is a picture of a pistol shrimp, which shoots a bubble that snaps and makes a very loud sound that stuns its prey. But humans, we also use sound in the ocean in many of the same ways. We use it for communication with our underwater telephones and acoustic modems. We use it to navigate with bathymetry mapping to make naval charts, and for using sonar to navigate. And we also, in a way, use it for survival by using fish finders to find food and depth sounders to make sure that we don't crash. But we're a lot noisier than other animals. We have our own us-specific sounds as well, like for resource extraction with seismic surveys for finding oil and ocean drilling. We make all sorts of sounds as scientists with profilers that can sense the thickness of ice or tell us about zooplankton in the ocean. We also do seismic surveys to learn about the Earth's crust. We have sonars for finding animals and Doppler profilers to figure out currents. And we make a lot of incidental noise that we don't even mean to make as well. Construction is really noisy, and we can't even get around quietly. Our boats make a lot of noise. So what are the effects of all of this noise on marine animals? Well, first we will have a Menti moment, and you can tell us your thoughts.
Great. So before we go to the Menti, since we're doing good on time, someone asked, Alice Wang asked in the chat, larvae use sound to find corals. So can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so larval corals and other reef larvae have been shown through research. They actually tracked larvae with video and were doing playback experiments, and they moved towards areas that have reef sounds to figure out where the reef is and where they should settle.
Wow, that's fascinating. I think many people are fascinated by this talk, so thank you for that. Let's go to this Menti moment. What are the negative effects of anthropogenic noise for marine organisms? For that, you can go to menti.com and enter the code 8050345. So, wow, I see that we have already a lot of answers: masking, behavioral impacts, physical damage, and even death. Confusion, they can get lost. Permanent threshold shift, temporary threshold shift, masking behavioral change. Wow, that's okay. Very precise. Great. Reduces comfortable habitat for wildlife. So, Christian, do you see some of those that you would like to comment on? So, for example, to find food sources, that must be very difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are going to talk about that in more detail coming up. I'm seeing a lot of really good answers. All of these are correct. So we'll talk about them in more detail.
Great, great. All right. And we also have some answers about pollution and a lot of confusion. So let's find out about more. Thank you. Back to you.
All right. So the answer is many of the answers given, but also it does vary by application. So scientific profilers are typically very high frequency, and I'll explain why this is important using this diagram. What we see here is the y-axis is attenuation. That means how quickly the sound is absorbed by the ocean itself, so how quickly the sound disappears as it travels. On the x-axis, we have frequency. So that's sort of like how high-pitched the noise is. And what we can see with the two red dots along the solid line being for salt water, is that 400 kilohertz sounds are absorbed 1 million times faster by salt water than sounds at 40 hertz. So this means that sounds like those that blue and fin whales make could potentially travel entire ocean basins because they're down around 30 hertz. Whereas a lot of the scientific profilers and sonars are absorbed very quickly by the ocean and have a very small area of effect. But other applications have really big implications. High power mid-frequency active sonar can inflict tissue damage and hearing loss on cetaceans, turtles, and fish. And I'm gonna play an example of this for you. You might wanna turn your volume down a little bit or take your earbuds out if you don't like really screechy noises. So I turned the volume way down on that one for you as well, and it's still pretty loud and pretty hard to hear. And it's been linked to beaked whale strandings as well, trying to escape the sound. Seismic surveys are also a very noisy human application of sound. When we want to learn about the ocean floor or we want to find oil, we use a seismic air gun, which makes really, really loud noises, and listen for the response with a towed array of hydrophones, as shown in this diagram. And these air guns can also be so loud that they inflict tissue damage and hearing loss on cetaceans, turtles, and fish. Pile driving is a bit of a surprising one as well, because the sound speed is so much faster in metal than it is in the water. Sound can build up in parts of the piles being driven and cause really high intensity sonic booms that can rupture tissue and kill fish. So some sounds have really, really big implications for what happens and can be very damaging. But these really loud, impulsive sounds are heavily regulated worldwide, as they should be. But what about quieter sounds like vessel noise? It's lower power, but it's pretty continuous and it might still have some effects. So what we're looking at here is the marine traffic report of where ships were over time. It's a heat map of the entire year of 2018. And we can see that there are lots of places where there's ships passing very, very regularly. And there's been research that's shown that in certain areas, shipping noise intensity has been doubling every decade, in some places for as long as the last 60 years. And looking more locally where I live, down in the Salish Sea area, we have a lot of ship traffic. And this report is only showing ships that have AIS, which is it tracks where ships are. And small boats don't have to have that. So this report of how much shipping happens in a year doesn't even include the greater than 100,000 recreational boats in the area. And ships can be pretty loud. There are low pressure regions behind fast turning propeller blades, and they drop the pressure so low if they're turning quickly that the water boils at ambient temperature. And we can see that coming off of the propeller blades in this image. And these bubbles, when they return to ambient pressure, actually implode. And not only is it loud, it can even damage the metal of the propeller itself. And poorly maintained ships are even noisier because you might have the shaft of the propeller rubbing against metal. You can have things clunking that shouldn't. And so I'm going to play an example for you of a noisy shipping container. And what you're going to hear is a really low frequency, sounds sort of like white noise, a whoosh sound. And that's actually the sound of all of the bubbles popping as they leave the propeller blades. And we'll also hear a lot of clunking because the ship probably hasn't been maintained very well. There's also an electric hum. So what are the impacts of vessel noise? Well, one of them, many of you guessed, is call masking. It's kind of like being in a big concert and needing to speak to somebody beside you. If you speak in a normal volume, they just won't be able to hear you. It's too loud. So you might have to shout. And we all know that there's an upper limit to how much we can do that. There's been research that has shown that some marine animals, like orcas, do raise the volume of their calls when they're around boat noise. But there's only so loud any animal can reasonably yell. So it does impact them. And it reduces their listening distance. For us, not being able to hear is not great, but so-so, because our primary sense is eyesight. But for animals that depend on sound to navigate, not being able to hear as well is like navigating in a thick fog. It impedes reproduction. Other female fish might not hear our lovely midshipman song if it's too noisy. And larval animals might not be able to find the coral reefs they need to settle on. And it increases effort. Having to try harder to stay together, to yell over the noise, and to find food just is taxing and stressful. And this can have long-term impacts on a population. And it impedes foraging itself. It makes it hard for animals to find their food. So what can we do about all of this vessel noise and other noises in the ocean? Well, let's hear your thoughts on it first.
Great. So before we go into the next question, we have some very interesting discussions in the chat going on, and maybe we want some of your input on this, Christian. So
Sure.
generally, cetaceans don't usually run from recreational or even scientific sonar, but they're mostly curious about it. Can you maybe comment on that? That came from a question. Are these the sonars that you would potentially find on recreational vessels? So that where you showed the spectrogram?
The sonar?
Yes, the sonar, yes.
Yeah, so that sonar was actually military sonar. But echo sounders on boats are still a problem. They tend to be, depth finders and fish finders tend to be in the same bandwidth as killer whale echolocation. So it can be problematic for animals. As for whether or not they approach boats, it's like anything that has an uncomfortable risk, you know? Like I love going to music festivals. I love being around loud music, but I wouldn't want to live there. So while they may be curious for a time, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have a long-term impact. And there is some recent research showing that they may have other avoidance behaviors, such as diving faster and deeper, that are not really apparent from the surface.
Okay, that's fascinating. Wow, I really like the example that you give, like going to a music festival, but not necessarily wanting to live there. And what about biofueling? We have a comment that says it can contribute to noise as well as singing propellers, not just cavitation.
Absolutely. So I did neglect to mention that, but biofouling is one of the many things that can go wrong if you don't maintain your boat. And it does make your vessel louder because you have to put more energy into moving the boat because of the increased friction. So that's another one to consider as well. And if you remove your biofouling, you'll also be more gas efficient. So it's in everyone's best interest.
Oh, very good. All right. So some people will take some tips today. Great. So now let's go to this Menti moment, which is a bit more reflective. So what is one action that you can take to reduce the negative impacts of ocean noise on marine life? So for that, go to menti.com and enter the code 805034 or simply comment on the chat. So wow, we have a lot of those coming in. Christian, you're probably seeing them too. So reduce speed of vessels in areas where there is a concentration of marine animals, measure the noise from vessel continuously, maintain our boat like you just mentioned, be quieter, that's interesting. Take less recreational boat rides, right? So that's a bit of a stretch for some people. Don't go on ships, right? Why not? Advocate to get laws put in place to regulate sound boat maintenance. Although there are probably some laws already, right, Christian?
We're getting there. It's an area of new research, and there are some regulations, and we're working on that.
Okay, great. What about electric propulsion boats, redesigning the propellant blades? Could that be possible?
Redesigning propeller blades does make a big difference in some situations, and it's one of the lost arts of people making big ships that aren't just made of off-the-shelf parts, is that having a correctly angled propeller blade does reduce a lot of cavitation, but it takes a lot of expertise to do that.
Right. What about creating quiet time schedules where ship traffic needs to slow down or not run at all? Would that even be possible?
I think it would be really challenging to have times when there's no ship traffic, just because there's also people who live on islands that need to get around, and there's shipping coming from overseas that doesn't have that much control over exactly when they come through.
Right.
But there has been new experiments in slowing down ships that happened locally in our region. And it was a voluntary experiment for people shipping overseas when they come through with their cargo ships to slow down if they wanted to as they pass over our hydrophones that were in the shipping lanes. And we had 80% compliance of people just volunteering to participate in that experiment and get to their destination slower. And it did substantially reduce the noise.
Wow, that's fascinating. Very interesting. We also have some links coming into the chat. So to all participants, make sure to check that. And we also have a lot of answers that are about buying local, so to not get things shipped across the globe. What do you think?
Absolutely.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Definitely.
How about, there's one more that popped up in the chat. How about noise cancellation techniques? The trouble with noise cancellation is the way that it works is when the sound is coming into your headphones, it produces an opposing sound to cancel it out. So the noise cancellation would have to be on the animals themselves so that they don't hear it. So that might be a big challenge, or around, but the whole boat radiates. It's not just the propeller, it's also the engine radiating through the hull. So it would be really challenging to do that.
And maybe on a similar note, what about like put silencers on boat?
So that would be a similar idea.
Right.
Maybe someone someday will come up with a way to do that, but it would have to be around the entire boat, because a lot of noise from engines even just radiates through the hull.
Okay, wow. So we just had a question in the chat also about the same topic. How effective are mitigations for piling and underwater construction? For example, bubble curtains.
I actually don't know a lot about bubble curtains, so I would have to look that up. I'm more aware of the regulations around when people can do those activities. So typically on ships that are doing seismic surveys or using sonar, or if they're going to do ocean drilling or pile driving, they have someone called a marine mammal observer on board. And that person's job is to be constantly scanning for animals, both with acoustics and with eyesight. And if they see an animal within a particular range called an exclusion zone, then all activities have to stop until the animals leave the area to prevent damage.
Oh, okay. Well, interesting. Good. All right. So, if anyone, we also had a talk from Richard Dewey about shipping noise and reduction during COVID-19. So we'll put the link in the chat for you in case you're interested. All right. Back to you, Christian. Thank you.
All right, so a few things that we can do. There's both the personal and the professional side of things. In the government and science, we're continuing to research the ways that different animals use noise and the effects on different species of our noise to better understand the impacts and be able to make more effective regulations to ensure that animals can continue their lives. There's also been a really big push recently in North America and Europe to establish ocean noise emissions guidelines and regulations. So that's continuing to happen now. We've just started. There are some preliminary regulations that are in effect, but the more we research, the better regulations we'll be able to come up with that are more effective. And there are some very innovative programs being trialed as well, such as the ECHO program out of Port Metro, Vancouver. This program was the program that funded the research, or was one of the, it was the program that did the research on the vessel slowdown experiments. And they're also trialing a program where they're incentivizing ship owners to maintain their vessels by measuring the amount of sound vessels are putting into the ocean on the way into the port and giving priority access to port docking if the vessels are quieter. So maybe if we incentivize, we might be able to encourage companies worldwide to deal with their vessels and make them quieter. And there's a lot we can do on a personal level as well. We can use our voices. This could mean educating friends. It could mean voting responsibly and voting for people who care about ocean animals and ocean noise as an issue, and writing to our government representatives to let them know that this is something that matters to us and that they should make a voting issue. We can also be conscious of the transportation behind what we buy. If we're buying things from overseas and it's going to be cheap transportation and take a long time, there's a really good chance it's coming on a ship instead of a plane. And that's going to put a lot of noise into the ocean. And if you're a boater, there's lots you can do. You can maintain your craft, keep the biofouling off, deal with propeller blade issues, etc. Only use your echo sounders when needed rather than having them on all the time. And following the Be Whalewise guidelines, which you can learn more about at bewhalewise.org. And these are guidelines for how to behave as a boater if there are marine animals in your midst. So thank you so much for participating. If you want more information, there's a few interesting links here. You can access our data at Oceans 2.0 on data.oceannetworks.ca. We also have a playlist of all of the sounds that we've recorded so far, or representative examples of all the interesting sounds on our YouTube channel. And our YouTube channel is Ocean Networks Canada. Ocean Networks, one word, Canada separately, and the playlist is called Sounds of the Deep. You can access the Be Whalewise guidelines at bewhalewise.org. And if you want to learn more about ocean noise and hear lots of examples of lots of different animals from around the world, you can check out the Discovery of Sounds in the Sea website, DOSITS. And there are also, in my region, 2 orca habitat live streams that are quite interesting, especially in the summer. orcasound.net, which records the southern residents, and orcalive.net, which records the northern residents.
Great. Thank you so much, Christian. This was very fascinating and extremely interesting. I think we saw that from the chat, a lot of interactions there. So just to remind all of you, please visit our websites at oceannetworkscanada.ca. Like Christian mentioned, our ocean data portal is free to use and it has a lot of great content. And please also follow us in our social media channels, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. And if you have any particular question or you want to tell us something, please email us at info@oceannetworks.ca. We also want to thank our funders. So Ocean Networks Canada is funded by the Canada Foundation for Innovation, the Government of Canada, Natural Resources Canada, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Canary, the Government of British Columbia, Transportation Canada, the University of Victoria, and many others. So if you need please, this was the last series for the webinars, for the fall series. So make sure that you can stay in contact with us, so you can subscribe to our ONC newsletters, or view the latest one on our website. So you can find that also. We're going to be sending all of those links in our thank you email in just a few days. So if you need to leave right now, please take 3 minutes to complete our satisfaction survey, which should be in the chat right now. And it will help us to improve our webinar series. So thank you for all of those that have to leave now. Thank you for those that have been following us from the beginning, from last summer. It has been a great ride with all of you. And also, if you can, please stay for the Q&A that we're going to have in just a few seconds. You can ask all of your questions to Christian. So thank you very much. All right, so for those that are staying for the Q&A, we're going to be doing the same thing. We're going to be using Mentimeter. So you can go to menti.com and enter the code 80, 50, 34, and 5. Could we answer maybe the first question, Kristen? Will ONC be contributing comments and expertise to the government's development of the National Ocean Noise Strategy?
Yeah, I believe we will be. And we have been participating in a lot of the regulation development. Even the ECHO program, which was doing the vessel slowdown experiment, used our tetrahedral hydrophone arrays that are deployed in the shipping lanes. So we're quite involved in the ocean noise strategies.
So can you tell us more about the melon organ in whales and dolphins?
I sure can. So the melon it's essentially a fatty sac. And in many species of whales and dolphins, there's actually multiple layers that are different densities. So it's kind of like a lens, like if you think about like a contact lens or an eyeglasses lens, but it's a fat lens. And if you want to get a really good look at the sort of physiology of this lens in an entertaining way, there are videos online of the beluga whales from the ones that used to be at Vancouver Aquarium. They used to have them display their melons by whipping their head around, and you could see the melon move separately from the head because it's just a big fat layer. So it's really funny and it's really interesting.
Oh, wow, that's very, yeah, I wish I could see that. That's very interesting.
So on YouTube.
Okay, great. I'm definitely going to YouTube that. All right. If the ships reduce their speed by, say, 10%, what is the percentage of noise reduction? Can you answer that?
I can comment on it. I'm going to be honest. I don't have a great memory for specific numbers, so I would have to look this up to give you a specific percentage. I can say that it made a difference, and how much of a difference it made does also have to do with what kind of ship it is. And it also has to do with which section of the noise band that we're listening to. So slowing down makes the biggest difference at low frequencies, doesn't necessarily make as big a difference in higher frequencies, especially for the big container ships. And it varies by vessel type. It'll make a big difference for slowing down small personal craft. Of course, it makes no difference for sailboats under sail. So it varies for sure.
Okay, good. Okay. You're cool, Christian.
Thank you.
Okay.
What can kids do?
What do you think about that?
I think one thing that kids can do that can make a big difference, and I did see that my mother is on this call and she has all sorts of memories of me being this kid. Tell your parents about this. Explain why it matters. Explain what you thought was interesting. Explain what they can do about it. And maybe they'll tell their friends. Maybe they'll vote responsibly until you're of age. So tell your parents.
Great, great. And we also have some teachers has participants today, and they said that this will be really great for their kids and all the links that we're going to send. So we have
wonderful.
Yeah, we're going to have more discussion on that. Great. How loud can be the animals themselves compared to artificial noise? Can they still be heard when everything else is going on?
So They can be pretty loud, but whether they can be heard, it's going to depend on how loud the artificial noise is and how close it is to the animal. So to give you sort of I know I just said I have no head for numbers, but I had a few numbers for this. To give you a number sense on this, many marine cetaceans can make quite loud noises up and around the high 100s to low 200s range of decibels. So that's very, very loud. And a lot of regulations expect that noise should not go higher than around 200, 250 decibels. So similar noise levels, unless it's something like mid-frequency active sonar or air guns, which are heavily regulated. But if there's a lot of boats around, and they're all very noisy, or if the boat is really close to the animals, then that means that the animals can only hear each other if they're right next to each other. Just like if you were way at the back of a concert hall, really far from the band, you could hear your friends really well. But if you're right at the front by the speakers, you're not going to be able to hear each other.
Oh, okay, that's very interesting. But also, maybe it's just my understanding, but some noise that we can hear, right, with our little human ears, or is that correct?
Yeah, so that is another thing to consider, is that animals hear in different hearing ranges than we do. Some of them overlap with our hearing range. We hear from about 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. Orcas are more like, oh, I'm gonna mess this up. probably more like 500 hertz to 100 kilohertz maybe.
Okay.
Delphinids are even higher than that. Some of them make their echolocation clicks much, much higher than we can even hear. So different noises in the ocean are going to have different impacts for different species. So while vessel noise is problematic for orcas whose hearing range overlaps with it, it might be less of an issue for beaked whales who are more concerned with things like sonar.
Okay, great. That's very interesting to know. I read something in news about U.S. Navy practice bombing exercises of the West Coast. Would these training exercises have impacts on marine life?
They sure would. And this is one of the reasons that I believe the US Navy does try and monitor whether there are animals in the area before running their exercises.
Okay. Well, at least they do that. Great. For the beginners, where and how to listen to listen to the ocean?
Yeah, so there's lots of ways to access ocean acoustic data. It's always collected with hydrophones, but lots of people put it on the internet. So you can check out Ocean Networks Canada sounds on our website or our YouTube page. There's also the OOI group down in the States who have hydrophones. MBARI, which is MBARI, it's the Monterey Bay Aquarium Institute. They have hydrophones that are streaming to the internet, and OrcaNet and OrcaLive are streaming as well. So there's lots of ways for you to listen to the ocean even from your home.
Great. So we'll be sending all of those links for all of you. Okay, another cool comment. Has there been any recent indicators where the COVID-19 hushed seas have had a positive impact on southern resident killer whales?
Unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of indication yet. And part of that is we're really going to want to see effects on a population level. We're going to be watching birth and death rates. And the orcas have a really, really long gestation. They tend to be pregnant for up to 19 months. That's a really long time. So we might not see the effects of this for a few years to come yet.
Okay, that's a very interesting comment. Yeah, so we need long-term studies in order to define that, right? So maybe
we do need long-term studies, and there are some shorter-term studies that happen. There's a group that studies orca poop, and they have a dog that sniffs it out. It's a very entertaining setup. And they collect it and test it for stress hormones. But unfortunately, the southern resident killer whales did not spend a lot of time in the Salish Sea this year. So it was hard to do any sort of on-the-water research.
So is it a big downside that, let's say if it takes a few years to find out, once we find out, is it too late to remediate for this situation, or?
I don't think it's ever too late. Information will come when it comes, and everybody's quite interested both in government and in research to figure out what the effects of this will be.
Okay,
so I think if the population trends show that this had a big impact, that's when people will start thinking about changing regulations to reflect that.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that comment. So thank you, it was very fascinating. Do you have any comments about the acoustic consequences of trawling? There was a blog about this topic on National Geographic last week.
I did not see the blog. I know all sorts of things about the ecological consequences of trawling because it's incredibly, incredibly directly destructive of reefs and catches a lot of bycatch, which is animals we didn't mean to catch that unfortunately died in the process. As for the acoustic consequences, I would imagine that it's somewhat similar to the consequences of shipping issues because we have a boat that's working really, really hard to pull the trawling. So it's going to put a lot of noise in the ocean.
Okay, interesting. So we also have a comment in the chat from Erica. Have you seen an increase in basking shark populations? So my father tells me there used to be a huge population. I read there was a rebound in the Scotland population. And thank you for this presentation.
Awesome. I've actually never seen a basking shark, to be honest. They used to live in this area and they've been very, very rare for quite some time. They had been hunted quite a lot and they're not very noisy. So they don't tend to show up in my data, but maybe a shark biologist would be able to answer that.
Okay, great. Well, if there are any shark biologists in the chat, please comment. All right. So let's go back to the Menti. Okay, does ocean temperature change audio signals in any way?
It sure does. And for the sake of time, I did not include a slide that goes into this in quite a bit of detail because the way that sound travels in the ocean is really, really complicated by temperature, pressure, and chemistry. In the air, sound travels pretty much in a straight direction, give or take. But in the ocean, temperature has an effect on how fast the sound moves, as does pressure and as does chemistry. And we can get, with the interaction of these three players, these really strange sound speed profiles from the surface to the bottom of the ocean. And sometimes we can even get these profiles that keep the sound at the surface, preventing it from going down because the sound keeps bending up towards the surface because the bottom's faster than the top. We can also have a downward refracting sound speed profile where the top moves faster than the bottom and sound tends to go towards the bottom. And there's even this profile in that's at, we call it the deep sound channel. And it's an ocean profile where the sound is fast at the surface and it's fast at the bottom, but it's slow in the middle. And so what happens is a sound wave, as it's moving, if it hits the top bends down, the bottom doesn't. And then it gets to the bottom and the bottom bends down and the top doesn't. And so the sound just oscillates and can travel really, really far without ever interacting with the surface or the bottom of the ocean. And there's even some research that shows that some whales are taking advantage of this, like blue whales and fin whales, because boundary interactions cause a lot of sound absorption. But if it travels in the sound channel, it can travel a whole ocean basin.
Wow. Yeah. I remember that I first came across that kind of knowledge when a friend of mine in Germany from the Navy, German Navy, told me that some submarines, either active in military or not, go to the Arctic to hide because you can't, because of what she just explained, right? The sound differs there. So they can be kind of stay put there and make no sound for a few months. So that I thought it was crazy. But yeah. So we also have a question, how old does a whale live for, more or less? Tough question.
More or less. Yeah, it more or less depends on the species. So we're talking anywhere from maybe like 20 to 30 years for really small animals to even up to 80 or 100 years for larger animals, possibly longer. And we know it's hard to track a lot of animals for that length of time, but we know more specifically for some of the southern residents who have been tracked for quite a while. And the oldest recorded southern resident died at around 105. So they can live a
Wow.
while.
That's amazing to imagine. Wow. Um, so are you involved in any work that to use algorithms to automatically detect and identify mammal sounds? Could you say in a few words about the potential for this?
Absolutely. So this is actually a huge area of research right now, and it's an area I'm very involved in directly. And we potentially 200 years for bowheads. Wow, I just saw that comment pop up. I knew that there were some that was longer, but I didn't want to venture a guess. As for the algorithms, worldwide, everyone is having this issue right now who has hydrophones where it's become really cheap to record and save data, which means that we have a ton of data and it's really expensive in terms of time, man hours, and paying people to go through the data manually. So we're really, really hoping for algorithmic solutions. And there's tons of research happening on this right now. We have a number of users at ONC who do a lot of this kinds of research. So you might be interested, if you're interested in this, at looking at something like Katos, K-A-T-O-S, which is an open source deep learning classifier that uses transfer learning. You can upload your own data. You don't have to be a programmer to use it. It's by some of our colleagues at Meridian. And there's many algorithms coming out all the time that we're testing. They're pretty useful for narrowing down the search of where an animal might be in a data set. They're good at eliminating times that there aren't animals. But unfortunately, if you have a lot of sounds, they're still not great for knowing exactly what's in every file, because typical, if you have a pretty good classifier, usually it's around like 80 to 90% correct. But if you have 300 sounds in a file, 80 to 90% still has quite a few mislabeled sounds. So there's still a lot of manual review that needs to happen, but these algorithms are getting better and better every day.
Very interesting. Are there any electric boats? Do they have less sound pollution?
So there may be. I don't know a ton about ship construction, but I can certainly venture some opinions on this nonetheless. I'm not sure about electric engines, but electric boats I expect would still have a lot of noise because a lot of it comes from the cavitation off of the propellers. So we'd get less clunky noise from the engine, but we'd still have the propeller noise. And electric things actually make a lot of noise themselves. A lot of electric things in the ocean make all sorts of humming sounds. So you may have experienced at some point plugging in like an RCA cable to a TV while it's on, or to a speaker and getting that hum. That happens with a lot of electrical things, and we can hear it in the ocean. So it's not, it might help, it might not, but the biggest difference is changing the propulsion method. So there is some research that shows that jet propulsion might be quieter than using a propeller.
Okay, great. I didn't know any of that, so it's good to know. Let's go to the next question. Are there any studies on noise impacting aquatic communities' assemblies?
I'm not sure I know what is meant by an aquatic community assembly. I'm going to assume that this means perhaps noise on an ecological scale, like for an entire ecosystem. And I don't know that there are studies that are studying the entire system, but we can still draw a lot of implications from the studies that are being done. So if, for example, we have ecosystems where, say we're talking about the tropics, where animals need to find the correct place to settle in their larval stage by hearing the sounds of the coral reefs. If they can't hear that, the coral reefs could actually die out. And if we have species that are critical species that are struggling to reproduce because of ocean noise, then that's going to have really far-ranging impacts on all of the animals that depend on that species. So while it hasn't been studied exactly, we can still infer that all of these things will have ecosystem level impacts.
Okay, wow, that's very interesting. And I'm still impacted by how larvae can hear coral sounds. Very cool. The recent regulations to the noise pollution in the seas have had a significant impact. Are they effective?
Yeah, so the recent regulations for noise pollution are drawn directly from research about how noise impacts marine animals and how far away from animals we need to be to have less of an impact, how fast we need to go or slow we need to go, and so on. So we already know that all of these regulations are going to have an impact. The recent regulations haven't been studied yet per se because they're very new. MBE is multi-beam echo sounder system. I can answer that question now when it comes back around.
Great.
But yes, we have every reason to believe that these regulations are going to be effective in making a difference.
So can you tell us something about the research with multi-beam echo sounder system and the impact with the animals?
Yeah, so multi-beam echo sounders are also quite noisy. I'm not sure that they're regulated yet. They do have impacts on mammals, and I saw some recent research presented just this last week, no, the week before last week at the, no, it was last week at the Acoustical Society of America conference. There is research going into multi-beam echo sounders now, and I suspect that there will be regulations coming.
Okay, great. Good to know that. So we have some comments in the chat, some specific ones. So what about the noise from hovercrafts or hydrofoils?
Yeah, so hovercrafts and hydrofoils are actually likely to be less noisy underwater. And the reason for this is that the air-water interface is the sound speeds are so different in those interfaces that not a lot of sound can travel through. It's usually reflected. So while a little bit of sound does get into the water, and we do occasionally, very occasionally, we could hear low-flying planes, so they will still make noise. A lot of the sound that they make will get reflected back into the air.
Okay, good. Very interesting. Okay, so we have a few more. Let's go back to Menti. Okay, do ocean animals have the intelligence to avoid noisy areas like shipping lanes? Do they have a survival mechanism to protect them from the adverse effects of intrusive sound?
So unfortunately, while they have the intelligence to avoid noisy areas like shipping lanes, we've put our shipping lanes through their hunting grounds. So there's not really a lot that they can do about it. They still need to use the areas that they use for finding food, and they can't just go somewhere else. As for survival mechanisms to protect themselves from adverse effects, many animals will move away from the really loud impulsive sounds like high frequency active sonar or mid-frequency rather, or seismic surveys. But if we start up our surveys when they're there, they might not be able to get away fast enough. And some of these sounds can travel really, really great distances. So we need to be monitoring a huge area to make sure that we're not impacting any animals.
And do we even know if there's still a few places in the ocean that are not noisy? Or
there aren't really many quiet places in the ocean anymore, not with how much shipping we have. Maybe in some small fjords, but you know, there's lots of deep sea creatures. And in fact, in fact, the background noise of the ocean, like the noise floor, which is the quietest that the ocean ever gets, if that's being recorded in any of the broader ocean basins rather than just in a quiet fjord, that has been doubling every decade. And that's because of shipping noise, because it travels and there's so many ships.
Wow, it's tough to be a aquatic animal in today's life. So how are soundscapes ambient noise meaningfully compared with so much variability produced from the differences in chemistry and physical parameters?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so typically soundscapes and ambient noise are compared at a particular location in a particular season. And so while there's a lot of chemistry and physical parameter variables in terms of how the sound travels, that's typically seasonally dependent. So the sound speed profile changes depending on if it's really, really hot and there's a lot of water evaporation making the surface saltier, or if it's raining a lot, which happens a lot in the winter in my region. And that's pretty predictable. We can also do propagation modeling to figure out what we should be able to expect to hear. And when that's done, often people will do CTD clasts, which measure the chemistry, the temperature, and the depth, which is an analog for pressure. And we can use those to figure out what the sound speed profile is and do the math to crunch how that's going to affect what we're recording to have better comparisons.
Okay, good. Thank you. Well, I guess we answered that question already.
Yeah.
I guess
How
it's
long
whale.
is the longest whale?
All right. Well, do you know it? The longest ever?
Yeah, the blue whale is the longest whale. I think it's 80 meters long.
Okay.
It's a big whale.
Yeah, that's
Maybe it's 80 feet.
Okay.
80 meters sounds pretty crazy.
Yeah, I'm like trying to imagine it, and wow. Okay. Right. So, is ONC open to discussing potential projects with companies from the Atlantic region? Can you answer that?
We absolutely are. We are considering sites wherever we can have instruments. We want to know as much as we can about the ocean. And we also work with organizations around the world who want to use our data. So if you are an organization in the Atlantic that would like to work with us, you should definitely reach out. We'd like to work with you.
Okay, great, great. Good to know. So I think it's a good note to end. Thank you to all the participants for all these great questions, and Christian, beautiful and very well thought answers. Thank you. You're very knowledgeable and cool. So thanks a lot. And we hope to see you very soon to all the participants. So keep up with us throughout the social media channels, our ONC website. And remember that we'll be sending all of those links for you. But don't forget to check out the latest ONC newsletter. So the December newsletter, it just came out. So there's a lot of great content over there. So thank you all once again, and please take 3 minutes to complete our satisfaction survey. Bye, y'all.